All right, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Patrick and I are happy to be here and happy to talk to you about something that is easy for he and I to talk about. We enjoy this stuff, but if you would ask most folks probably about 5 years or so ago, they would ask, what the heck is a drone? What are we talking about? Why would we want to talk about that? They would have probably looked at us like we had two heads. So, you know, nowadays I think at least everybody is familiar with the term. I'm not sure if you might still think we had two heads, but we'll go with you wanting to hear a little bit more about where things are at with drones. So it is a rapidly expanding market. Certainly, Patrick will get into some numbers on the market size here in a little bit, but multiple sectors are using them broadly across various industries, bringing up what are multiple risk management concerns. Concerns that, as the style of our presentation goes, everything old is new again, are not going to be new from a problem standpoint, but they are new from where those problems are arising from. So we're going to talk about this at essentially the Drone 101 level, and then dig down into a little bit more as we get on, and hopefully you'll learn some stuff on that as we go along. I like to relate that, yesterday out at the beach shack, there's George out there gives a nice snorkeling 101 class, and it's just starting from how to put the equipment on and using it, and then an hour later you're out there swimming with turtles and picking up sea urchins. So hopefully, we're going to try to meet that level of knowledge that we're going to try to impart. But I think perhaps we've set that bar a little too high there, because I don't know that we can compete with something. But with that, we want to get into from certainly traditionally aviation loves lingo. Alphabet soup is exactly where the aviation world loves to be. Throw in the FAA and the government bureaucracy, and that soup gets pretty thick pretty quick. But so we're going to refer to these things as drones. Again, just referring back 5 years ago, if I said drones, the industry that was trying to develop at the time would have hated that term. They wanted to try to use different acronyms, UAV, UAS, RPAS, because they thought there was, and there's probably still some truth to it, a connotation with drone to the military uses and some of just the political issues that are come to mind when we use the term drone. But that concern has subsided over the course of the last few years, and so we're just going to go with drones. It's easier to keep it clear for what we're talking about. But that doesn't mean that there aren't all sorts of different types of drones that are out there. We've identified those three categories there, and when we get into Patrick will talk some about the regulatory landscape that's there. The FAA treats these things differently based on the size of the platform that's at issue. Micro UAS is sitting at about 1/2 pound or less. Small UAS, which is kind of where I call right now the sweet spot, that's about at 1/2 pound up to about 55 pounds. And that's where you've seen the explosion in commercial uses that have taken off from the hobby uses that were proliferating beforehand. Large UAS is what we would refer to as the military uses, the weaponized platforms, or the larger platforms that are out inspecting borders and things of that nature. So what we're going to focus on today is that sweet spot, that small UAS, where the commercial uses are really taking off and where your insurance interests are likely to be the largest. So I think we'll turn that over to Patrick, and we'll go from there.
Great. So to the extent you're not familiar with the different platforms that Matt identified, we thought we'd just show a couple of quick videos to give you a sense of what these things can look like and do. So we can play the first one here. This is an example of the micro UAS or micro drone Matt mentioned, less than 1/2 pound, and because of the battery size in this, you're going to have a very short flight time. This, what you're looking at here, is a DJI Inspire 1. It falls into the small UAS category. That platform weighs about 6.5 pounds. It has a flight time of roughly 18 minutes. Battery restraints on flight time is still a significant technological issue, and can get up to speeds of about 50 miles an hour. This is a Yamaha RMAX. This is an agricultural platform that weighs about 200 pounds. And as you can see, it's got tanks on either side of that, basically the helicopter that's used to spray fields. This footage is actually taken in Japan, and these platforms have been used for roughly 20 years in Japan. Yamaha reports that the RMAX treats about 2.4 million acres of farmland in Japan annually. With the loosening of the regulatory requirements here in the US, this type of platform is coming. And for those of you who are familiar with agricultural aviation crop dusters, this is the future of agricultural aviation. There have been a number of studies that have been done the last couple of years. We've put up some of that market data for you, as Matt mentioned. I think there's really two takeaways from the data. There's differences on what the numbers are going to be, but everybody that has looked at drones has agreed that they are going to have a very significant financial impact in the next 5 to 10 years. There's just no question about that. It's just what the numbers will ultimately be. And so I think there's two takeaways. One is this is big business coming forward and a lot of opportunity. And number two is that drones are more and more going to become a part of everyday life for a number of industries, and we'll talk about some of those industries. And so those of us that are either using drones or interacting with drone companies are going to have to consider that as we put together our risk management platforms, because they're out there, they have to be considered and be addressed. The last bullet point, I think, really gives some perspective as to how fast this market is growing. The FAA, for time immemorial, has had a registration requirement that you have to register your traditional manned aircraft with the FAA, and that's how you get the N number you see on the tail of the commercial aircraft you flew over. In December 2015, the FAA decided it was going to put in place a drone registry, and it was bifurcated. If you were a hobbyist user, you just had to register once, and you could use that registry number for all of your drones, one or multiple drones. If you were a commercial user, you have to register each and every drone you're operating. Within 6 months, less than 6 months, there were more drones registered than there were traditional manned aircraft. And that it's essentially a voluntary compliance issue. So within 6 months, we've got more drones registered than traditional manned aircraft. In less than 2 years, we have more than 750,000 drones registered. And that actually understates it a bit, because if you think about it, hobbyists are only registering once. They're not registering each and every drone they have. So a massively growing field. The FAA in March came out with some projections as to where they see things going for all of aviation in the next 5 to 10 years. And we just put up some statistics for you, which shows that in a rare instance, the FAA actually agrees with private industry is saying.
So who's using the platform? It started, and that sweet spot that we talked about, those were started as largely recreational users. These grew out of a community that were effectively remotely controlled aircraft enthusiasts. And that has since grown with the ability for technology to allow more data processing and the sensor suites that are allowed to be put onto these platforms. There are millions of registered users that are just using them in that category. They're using them to take amateur photographs. Out here in a wonderful location like this, they might want to take some scenery shots. Although, and I think as someone noted beforehand, the hotel has advised that there is no allowed usage of drones on the property. So
We can help you if you have a legal issue, though, so just come talk to us.
So it's just a lot of fun and a lot of endless options that are out there. Dronies is a bit of a thing, using your drone to kind of follow you around, take pictures of you, take a selfie of yourself. Drone racing, which, as we'll see actually in the next slide, is actually transitioning from what would just been a bit of a hobby use into a commercial use. Drone fishing, which if you haven't seen that's a treat. Get on YouTube and Google that. These guys are using drones to get out there and not only spot where fish are, but drop in the bait, and then you're off and running. It's a good bit of fun, and I know some folks here have done that. So you might be able to talk to some folks around and get hooked up with a drone fishing operation. And literally anything else you can dream of is really where things are at, from what you can do with these things. From an educational standpoint, high schools are certainly, with a big push towards STEM classes, are incorporating drones into their educational work. The universities have set up degree programs themselves. There are a number of engineering and technical schools that have dedicated programs related just to drones, and the platform development, the software development that goes along with it. We'll talk a bit in the future, but it's not just the engineering and technical side of universities that are exploring their uses right now, but there's Bard College out east has set up a center for the study of the drone. So these are the folks that are just looking at the impact on their uses and the integration of them actually into what will be the revised national airspace once these things are kind of up and running. But so for a little bit more fun of looking at what these platforms look like from just a fun standpoint, we're going to give you a little video of this drone racing. So this would be like you're putting on a headset and you're flying with it. So if you're a little motion sickness, you might turn away. Drone racing has really taken off. Allianz is the title sponsor for what has become a league of drone racing. ESPN has broadcast rights to this stuff. It's coming. The hobby fun, this is obviously a hobby use that's here, but has really transitioned into what's going to be a significant commercial endeavor.
I don't know how they got through that.
It's okay. No, absolutely. So these are, you've seen the headsets that folks put on for the VR. These guys are using that to fly these things around. So aside from the fun, though, the commercial uses, the industries using them are widespread. Insurance, obviously, number one, is near and dear to your all hearts, and ours as well. But so Patrick, myself, and others at our firm are assisting your compatriots in entering the market in terms of offering coverages. Coverage issues related to covering those risks, and then just from internal uses that insurance companies use from adjusting claims and gathering data to help from the underwriting side. But in large part, these systems are new data collection platforms, and that's what we think about when we think about drones as being able to get up and go places where you used to either have to have a significant manned risk, so a lot of these tower inspections, a lot of bridge inspections, a lot of property inspections, where you had significant risks of persons being up in dangerous areas are now being replaced by the use of drones with a nice sensor platform that's going to be able to take over those roles. So energy, again, a big inspection going along pipelines is the perceived use that's there. There are a big push behind some of the need for the FAA to get beyond line of sight allowance for operations. Patrick will talk a little bit more about that as well when we get into regulations as to what's holding back the industry from expanding even further than it has already. Construction, they'll send these things up at the end of a construction day, at the end of a week, to show status reports, in addition to just showing off and getting off a book of progress for themselves from a marketing standpoint. Telecommunications, again, you're getting up to high-risk areas and doing inspections where you used to have to put people up there. Real estate, the transportation, media, agriculture, the list goes on. Agriculture, we saw that the crop dusting variant that's being used in Japan. Beyond that, here in the U.S., currently you can use them, certainly from an adjusting standpoint, to get out for crop damage claims, for assessing, and you put different sensors on them. They can identify for agricultural users whether there is disease in the plant, whether a particular area of the field needs to have additional fertilizer or watering. All of that adds to the significant commercial benefit that comes from the use of these platforms. Again, it's not just commercial, the government uses, and this is perhaps when we think of drones where people originally first kind of jump to is the military use. There recently have heightened, and the FAA has restricted the use of any drones near military bases. They want to kind of keep that fund to themselves. But these platforms are in a large part used from a homeland security standpoint, from a war security standpoint. So wherever you fall on the current administration's desire to build a wall, these platforms are certainly part of what would be used to secure those borders. There is a notion of local authorities weaponizing drone platforms. Local police had that under consideration in Connecticut, if you could believe it. That has thankfully been kicked aside for the moment, because I don't think at least most want to be in a world where drones are flying around and are actively weaponized. But those are the types of issues that are currently on the table. We are in a bit of the wild, wild west still, and so those ideas are still getting kicked around. For, I guess to say, some security, it's not just the authorities that are being restricted on weaponizing these platforms, but individual users as well. And we'll get you a video on that a little further down the line, but a little teaser before we go on.
And that's a good video. Regulation of platforms. So we've talked a little bit about the market, the uses. Now we wanted to talk to you about what you have to do to comply to use these things, what the regulations are. Again, we come to this from a traditional aviation background. Matt and I do a lot of aviation work. The FAA has also come to this field from a traditional aviation background and are trying to figure out how to fit in drones to the world they know and understand. With respect to the regulation of, when we say platforms, we mean the actual physical drone itself. In traditional manned aircraft, there is a very great degree of regulation over the design and manufacture of components in aircraft themselves and all the components that go into them. When the FAA finally got around to issuing its drone regulations last year, and we'll talk about those, it made a determination that it was not going to attempt to regulate the platforms, the hardware themselves. And there are a couple of factors that went into that. One is, a drone isn't carrying anybody. It's not being used for common carriage and flying around hundreds of people. So the risk profile is different. The other is that by the time the FAA finally got its regulations out, there were hundreds of platforms out there, and of course it was already out of the barn, so to speak. It was just too far gone for that. But because there is no regulation of the platforms themselves, you're going to see a significant amount of divergence in the quality and reliability of some of the platforms out there, particularly in these early days, because there's no standard that you need to meet to have a drone fly. There's no battery life standard. There's no reliability standard. There's none of that there. And so that's going to make it, as we know, more difficult to rate risks if you're out there underwriting these things, or if you're using them, figuring out what to use and how reliable they're going to be.
Patrick, before you go on, so we're focused on the FAA. We're here in the U.S. on the U.S. sources, but other jurisdictions have looked at the issues as well and are struggling with the regulatory environment themselves. Canada, for instance, recently they had a near miss of one of their aircraft on arrival of a Bombardier aircraft, and so Transport Canada has tried to push their regulatory world to look from kind of a risk-based platform, how big they are, where they are, and how they're using them, versus where we're sitting at currently in the U.S. with the platform size and restrictions based on that environment.
So if there's no regulation of the platforms themselves, what's the regulation of the operators? And as we know here, it really depends on the use. As Matt said, drones kind of come out of your old remote control flying air clubs. And what the FAA has been doing is trying to walk a delicate balance between leaving those folks free to operate the way they traditionally have been and having some regulatory authority over the explosion of the use of these things, particularly in a commercial sense. And so what they've done is created a dichotomy where they are regulating commercial users but not hobbyist users. It's not part of our presentation today, but I will tell you, particularly if there's anybody here that's using a drone for a recreational hobbyist purpose, there's some significant issues about what you need to actually do to qualify if you really dig into the regulations as one of those recreational users. It's not quite as easy as you'd think, but that, again, that's a discussion for a different day. So we're going to focus on the commercial users for purposes of our talk. The FAA announced regulations in June of last year. They became effective in August of last year. They are, it's referred to as 14 CFR Part 107, or Part 107 is the lingo in the industry, and this was the first time that the FAA announced federal aviation regulations directly addressing the operation of drones. So if you want to use a drone for commercial purposes, you've got to comply with Part 107. If you have a public user, meaning again state or local government, you can either comply with Part 107 or you can request a specific certificate of waiver or authorization from the FAA to allow you to do different specific things. But generally speaking, Part 107 rules the day. And what I will tell you is that before Part 107 came into effect in August, if you wanted to use a drone for commercial purposes, you had to go through and submit what was called a Section 333 exemption to the FAA. It was a long document, a number of requirements that you had to satisfy. It could take anywhere from 60 to 120 days to get approval to go out and do your operations. And that approval came with a number of significant limitations attached to it. The number one and most significant limitation that was attached to it is you had to have a licensed pilot out there flying your drone. So the FAA said if you're going to do it commercially, whoever's flying that thing has to have a pilot's license. And that was a huge barrier to entry.
Yeah, the long and short of it on that is what the FAA considered was that these, 10 to 50 pound little drones were the equivalent of the 747. So all the regulations that would have applied to traditional aircraft were being applied to these drones. So that process that Patrick talked about was the process that you would use to get exemptions from all of the litany of historical regulations that applied to full-size commercial aircraft.
So what does Part 107 provide? Well, first of all, your drone's got to weigh less than 55 pounds, so you've got to fall into that small UAS category we talked about. And you've got to register your drone with the FAA, with the drone registry we mentioned. Really significant here is Part 107 created a new type of pilot certificate, and it's called a remote pilot and command certificate. And now if you want to operate a drone commercially, you don't have to go out and get your manned pilot's license. You can go out and obtain a remote pilot and command certificate. In order to obtain this certificate, you need to pass an FAA aeronautical test. You need to submit yourself to a TSA background check, which any pilot has to go through. And then you have to be 16 years of age, fluent in English, and in a physical and mental state that will allow you to safely and properly operate the drone. And so I will tell you that is a massive sea change, because before, if you were going to go get a pilot's license, it costs thousands and thousands of dollars and can take a significant amount of time. So a giant barrier to entry has been taken down by application of the remote pilot and command certificate. The other issue I really want to highlight on this slide is the visual line of sight restriction, which Matt alluded to earlier. In order to operate under Part 107, your drone has to stay within line of sight of the unaided eye. So that means you can't fly it behind a building where you can't see it. You can't fly it further, if you go out over the ocean, further than you can see it with the unaided eye. And that has a substantial limitation on what type of operations you can actually perform. You can just imagine what a limiting factor that is. That comes, again, going back to traditional aviation concepts, from the concept of sense and avoid. And that's a very important concept in manned aircraft and manned aviation, to make sure you can see obstacles in other aircraft that are out there and be able to avoid them. All the airplanes everybody flew in on to get to this conference have very sophisticated systems to make sure that two planes aren't going to have a mid-air collision, that they know what to do if they get near each other. That's how that's addressed. Right now for drones, we have the visual line of sight restriction. There are a number of companies, a number of folks out there working on solutions to the visual line of sight restriction that will allow through software and sensor platforms to address that issue so that you can fly and that your drone will safely know what's around it and avoid those things. The FAA is very concerned with this issue because the FAA's biggest fear is having a drone collide with a manned aircraft. I mean, it's just that simple. That is their absolute biggest fear. And the FAA is going to have to be very, very comfortable with those solutions before they are adopted on a widespread basis and we can get beyond the visual line of sight restriction. We put up just a couple of other of the key limitations or requirements under Part 107. These aren't all of them. It would be awfully boring to go through them all, but you can only fly during daylight or civil twilight if your drone's equipped with anti-collision warning. For those of you who aren't familiar with civil twilight, it's 30 minutes before dawn, 30 minutes after sunset. You can fly up to 400 feet above ground level, or if you're inspecting a structure, which again is a major use for these, you can be within 400 feet of the structure. So originally there was an idea of a 400-foot hard cap on how you could fly. That would obviously limit doing any really good structural inspections. Anything over 400 feet you wouldn't be able to use a drone on. So the FAA has taken I think a pretty common sense approach saying stay within 400 feet of the structure. No flying over persons not directly involved in the operation. And that really means people that are absolutely critical for the mission. This is again a fairly significant limitation that's out there. A lot of people probably watched the Super Bowl. Lady Gaga was up at the top of the stadium singing away. There were drones in the background making the American flag symbol. Looked really cool. That was actually all pre-recorded because they could not operate those drones over a crowd of people. The FAA won't let you do it. I think we'll get there eventually, but right now that limitation is there. There's also an accident reporting requirement. If you have an accident that involves serious personal injury, loss of consciousness, or property damage in excess of $500, you have to report that to the FAA within 10 days. Something that's not in Part 107 that I think is noteworthy is there is no insurance requirement under Part 107. The FAA does not mandate that you have any type of insurance to go out and operate a drone commercially. I think Matt and I are both of the view that you should, that it's very important to go out and get that type of coverage. And we'll talk about the types of coverages that are out there, but there is no insurance requirement to operate a drone commercially. What's not allowed? There's no package delivery of any real significance. Amazon is not going to be delivering drones to your house quite yet. I do think we'll get there. Amazon has actually been, both in the current administration and the prior administration, at loggerheads with the policymakers about testing and getting that going. They're working actually over in England. They've gone to England and have a better relationship over there to do a lot of the package delivery testing. We're going to get that. I think it's going to be different in the suburb compared to package delivery in Manhattan, but we'll be there. Again, no beyond visual line of sight, no night operations, and no operations over crowds are the main ones. The last bullet point is worth noting. When Part 107 was announced last year, the FAA acknowledged two things. One is they acknowledged publicly that they cannot keep up with the pace of technology. They're actually way behind the ball by the time they finally got Part 107 out. And they understand and appreciate that the technology is advancing so rapidly. From a regulatory perspective, they can't pass laws and come up with regulations fast enough to keep up. And the other thing they accepted is that operating drones is done in different risk profiles. It's one thing for me to walk outside of our office in Chicago and fly a drone with a banner saying, hire Patrick and Matt for your drone legal needs. And it's another thing for Matt to go to his in-laws farm in rural Iowa and fly a drone over and take a look at the property. And so the FAA has said, if you have a use that is not permitted by Part 107, you can make a submission, tell us what you intend to do, tell us what technology you're going to use, and how you're going to do it safely and effectively so that you don't increase the risk of harm to others. And we will consider it and likely or potentially issue a certificate of waiver of authorization. That has been a very popular route. I can tell you that the FAA's website now is reporting you need to wait at least, or expect to wait at least 60 days to get it processed. So just because you can't do it under Part 107 doesn't mean you can't do it absolutely. There are a number of operations that you can obtain a COA for, as it's referred to, but you've got to make the submission to the FAA and you've got to give yourself some time to get it passed.
Okay, so Patrick's hit the regulation side pretty hard. This is where a lot of what needs to happen needs to develop is with the FAA and the regulations and how they're going to apply and the different allowances that the FAA is going to permit in addition to how it's going to integrate the operation of those different platforms within the traditional aviation airspace, national airspace. But it's not just a regulatory environment that is a new landscape. We've got a whole bunch of state and municipal privacy laws that are out there. If I could back you up actually to the barnstorming era, the original development of the FAA actually came through the Air Commerce Act and the need for all of the patchwork of various state laws that were out there at the time that were trying to respond to all of the crazy pilots that were out, speaking of rural Iowa, flying around and diving around and landing in fields and destroying property in that respect. And so the various states have developed a patchwork of laws that were applying to those uses of traditional aircraft. The precursor to the FAA is what came out of that, where the federal system realized that we need a unified federal system that's going to apply to those situations. And so that's what led essentially to that development. What was left behind is what's still on the books in a lot of states, are state aviation laws that arose from that environment. The interesting aspect of what sits with those is the definition of aircraft, and we'll get into a little bit of that additionally as well when we look at that definition within the policy context. But in the regulatory environment and the state regulations that are out there, the definitions of aircraft are pretty broad. In a lot of instances, especially with how the FAA has interpreted the term in order back prior to its passage of Part 107, when it was trying to apply the traditional body of regulatory law to drones, they defined that aircraft, the definition of aircraft, to include things like unmanned aerial vehicles. So that definition and where you fall on whether or not that's an accurate way to look at the technology and to define that, there are arguments that that definition fits you into an old body of law, traditional aviation law, which has a number of aspects that flow from it. The patchwork that's out there, again, there's an old one that comes from the barnstorming era, and there's a new one that is developing predominantly from the privacy implications that folks have realized is an important aspect to consider. Bard College, the school I mentioned earlier, has a center in which issued just recently a study identifying 135 localities in 31 states that have passed some sort of drone rule. So that's I don't know, patchwork. That's pretty big. That's pretty big quilt. Yeah. So there are a number of varying localities where the laws are just going to be different. So the FAA, certainly from the operational standpoint, has come out and said, well, whoa, let's hit the brakes on all of that. This is our environment. We want to control how and when you're going to be able to use that. We don't want an operation in California to be different from an operation in New Hampshire. What they have done is punt on the notion of whether or not the FAA has within its mandate the ability to regulate and protect privacy implications that flow from the operations. So while the operational side, you can certainly expect preemption issues where the federal courts are going to come in and say, no, federal law trumps, and this is the law that's going to apply. From the privacy standpoint, they've kicked the ball on that. And so that patchwork that's out there is going to stay. Now, is that new? Is that old? It's probably old, right? Because you have your states are currently vary as to how privacy laws are going to be applied. The one aspect here that I'll mention down here, this good old Team Willie. This is a fun case to try to look up if you get some chance. He's got a Facebook page, so you can find him pretty easy. But William Meredith has self-styled himself the drone slayer, and so he is a champion in some respects of the privacy implications that come from uses of drones. Now, the facts behind this particular case is he was not the drone operator. He's a shotgun-toting property owner, who has a lovely family. Apparently, his daughter out in the backyard was sunbathing. A drone came flying by a few times. He took the notion that he thought the drone was taking photos of his daughter, got out his shotgun and shot it down. How you come down on that? I guess I wouldn't want photos of my daughter being taken either. Whether I have the ability to shoot one down is another question, particularly if you're in a populated area. But at any rate, the drone operator filed a lawsuit, tried a couple of different avenues to prosecute Mr. Meredith. The local state authorities did not choose to take up that claim. So he got away from any unauthorized use of trying to fire a weapon at an aircraft, discharging an unlawful weapon, those sorts of claims he avoided. So the drone owner filed a suit in federal court trying to establish that he was within his rights, property rights that is, to operate within 500 feet of the ground. And I'll give you where that 500 feet comes from is, again, everything old is new again, right? So back in 1942, World War II era, the U.S. military had started to commandeer a bunch of property to train and get its aircraft up and running and flying in and around different farm locales, one of which had a series of big heavy bombers that were flying over a fellow's chicken farm. That chicken farm, all those chickens in there got very scared of the noise and the commotion to the point where they essentially were fluttering and banging around each other so much that they died. So he lost all his chickens. The upshot of that being he lost the ability to use his farm. He brought a suit against the U.S. government that amounted to a Fifth Amendment takings of his property. What flowed from all of that at the end, which at the end of the day is still an uncertainty, but is where does your personal property begin and end from an air rights perspective? So if you think about it, right, if you out on your property, you need to build a fence, right? You need to build your house. There is some amount of airspace above the ground level that is reasonably yours to use and put to use. So you have to have some right in that area to be able to use to reasonably use your property. But how high up does that go is where your question comes. And from the chicken farmer standpoint, he ended up losing at the end of the day. But the glide path of the aircraft flying over his property was a reasonable enough use by the government. But the glide path of that, the way the aircraft landed over his property, essentially lines up with about 500 feet. 500 feet AGL above ground level is where the so-called highway in the sky that the FAA patrols begins. So everything above 500 feet, aside from if you're around a military base, around other critical infrastructure, you essentially have ground level up to 500 feet is supposed to be somewhat open use. But it's as somewhat of an open question because it's a reasonable use that you're being that you're putting that airspace to use in. So this back to the drone slayer, the drone operator was trying to test this issue because this is an open question. This is something that hasn't been resolved, and unfortunately, I'll give you a little reading the last page of the book first. The drone slayer wins. So we still don't have a good answer as to where the federal airspace begins and ends, and where your private airspace begins and ends. But the drone operator sues Mr. Meredith with the notion, trying to get it into federal court, trying to get a determination that, hey, I was flying this within what was my property, within my 500 feet of the AGL. That was a reasonable use of that airspace. And tied onto that was, again, we get into that notion of how do you define these things? Is it an aircraft? Is it a drone? Should this drone actually be considered an aircraft? Because there's a federal statute on the book that if you shoot down an aircraft, that's a federal offense. So these claims are out there. They're being litigated. They're unfortunately not being resolved very quickly because, as federal judges are wont to do, the judge here essentially kicked the can on it and said, well, what it sounds like to me is this was largely a dispute between neighbors, and so that really isn't enough to make a federal case out of it. Is long and short of it. And so he punted on a jurisdictional basis. And so while it's a very interesting legal issue that's out there, one that needs to be decided and one that we're going to have an answer on before we know which way to go, we're not there yet. But to move along to, we'll hold off on playing this quite yet, but we mentioned before the restrictions on weaponizing drones. the local authority uses that the Connecticut authorities were looking into and that have thankfully passed on. We talked about, and I mentioned there, that there are private users that are, maybe or maybe not taking legitimate, using their creative license legitimately, but there's a lot of folks that are having fun with these things. This fella here is again from the perhaps cut from the same cloth as our drone slayer folks, are trying to test the boundaries of what they're allowed to do on their own property and within their own reasonable uses, I should say. So we want to run this. Okay. So this is a guy, actually a miner at the time, created his own platform. That's a flamethrower he's got on a drone that is flying there, and is trying to roast his turkey. At any rate, so the FAA got into that and said, "Whoa, hey, that's pretty cool, but we'd like to talk to you a little bit more." The fun part of that is he also has a separate drone where we hooked up a hose to it, so he can put out the fire that he starts.
Very responsible young man.
Yeah. But he did have an issue with the FAA coming in. His father had an issue with the FAA coming in and saying, "Hey, we want to talk to you a little bit more," because they say, "Hey, I'm on my own property. I'm doing my what I want with it." But the FAA ultimately, and the federal court ultimately agreed with them, said, "Well, no, when you're taking a step to what appears to be militarizing the thing, we're going to have the right to actually talk to you about it." But so if you want to play this next one, we're running through, and we're running a little short on time, so we're going to try to get these videos in here. These guys are looking at, right, as the title of the slide there indicates, potential liability exposures, right? So what you can imagine can go wrong probably will go wrong with these things. So listen, if you can't see that, those are power lines there on the left of the screen. A bit like the bug zapper in the backyard. And what may be a familiar locale around here, nice yoga near the beach maybe. So those have a little bit more fun to them. This one, a little warning, is a bit dramatic. So, but it is certainly from a standpoint of laying out, the domino effect of what can happen and the potential risk exposures that are out there. Spot the claim there, right? Any number of things that can go wrong will go wrong there. And, policy respond in it? How is it going to respond? We're looking at certainly some traditional claims that we can all spot right off the bat. In that respect, is your $1 million cover that you have for a little bit of an add-on for a small operation would be sufficient to cover that sort of exposure. Those are all considerations that are fun to have. But from just the hobby uses, the drone slayer uses, we look at, we saw a lot of property damage, a lot of bodily injury, personal injury claims in that last video. The notions of trespass, of invasion of privacy, nuisance, the cybersecurity. So we talked about these things being data collection platforms. A big aspect of what's out there is to how do you interrelate the coverage that you're going to have for the data protection that you're collecting. Because when you're collecting all that data, what are you going to do with it? Where are you going to put it? Various federal laws, obviously, and some of you are going to be familiar with those, restrict that say, hey, if one aspect of the company, this is how I use and protect data. Here, if you're not going to do that in the same way, you expose yourself to claims there. So at any rate, we pick that back off to seeing, all right, here's the type of exposures that are out there. What's been the insurance industry response to those?
Thanks, Matt. So what we've seen initially in the early days was a significant move into specialized drone coverage. That has largely been done by the traditional aviation insurers. Global Aerospace, AIG, Allianz, et cetera, have come up and said, hey, let's put out specialized coverage for drone operations. It has been a very hard market for aviation insurers for a number of years, so they've seen this as a great opportunity to try to start getting some premium in, increase their business, and everybody agrees, as we talked about earlier with the market data, there is going to be a great desire and demand for this type of coverage. We've also seen new entrants into the field, folks that haven't traditionally been in the aviation sector are looking to get into drone coverage. There's both first-party property as well as liability coverage. Some insurers are staying away from the whole coverage. They don't want to get into that. We understand there's a pretty wide divergence or wide variety of limits that are available based on fleet size, fleet value, and what you're actually out there doing. The other thing we've seen is a movement into usage-based insurance, which Matt mentioned earlier, and this is an ideal platform for it. There's an entity out there called Verify, which is I want to go out and I have to inspect a roof somewhere in California outside of Pasadena, La Cañada. I need to inspect a roof here. I'm going to be up for 25 minutes doing it. I need coverage for that operation only. You put it in on your app, you go up and fly, the coverage is $10, $15, and you're getting a use-based. And I think we're going to see a lot of that. That's going to be a big push. I know we're looking at that in other lines as well, but it's really particularly beneficial for drone coverage. We talk about a modification of existing coverages to include drone operations. There's just ambiguity out there right now in a number of the policies as to whether or not you have coverage. You take your general CGL policy, it's got an aircraft exclusion. As Matt mentioned, is a drone an aircraft or isn't it? If you talk to the FAA, it is an aircraft. It has to be an aircraft in order for the FAA to be able to regulate drones. But you could imagine having an accident with a property owner or with a business owner. He's got a drone, he has an accident, he turns around and seeks coverage. The insurer says, you've got no coverage because the aircraft exclusion applies. And he's saying, hey, you're crazy, this isn't an aircraft, and that's not what that exclusion was intended to apply to. So what we've seen are insurers trying to bring some clarity to that. ISO now has products out. You can have limited endorsements to write the coverage back and limited exclusions to make it clear that essentially the drone falls within the aircraft exclusion. We've seen this in other ways. Everybody thinks of kind of the examples Matt put up of a drone crashing into a building, and that's your liability exposure. XL Catlin announced last year that it was expanding its professional liability coverage for architects and engineers to provide coverage for wrongful acts arising out of work product derived and data collected from drones. So this doesn't have anything to do with the operation of the drones, but they realized that their insurers are going to be out there using them to prepare work product to collect data, and they wanted to have coverage for that. So it's really, everything old is new again. We've got a new risk. It's unclear how it's going to apply to our coverage. Let's attempt to clarify and improve our wordings to provide some significance and clarity as to what coverage is there and isn't. And I think you're going to see a lot of cases and a lot of issues decided in the next couple of years where this all kind of gets hashed out. We've got a bullet point up there, the state insurance department comments. In late 2015 is when the FAA sort of saw this rush of demand for hobby drones, that they had projections of huge volumes of people buying them and giving them as Christmas presents, holiday presents. And so the state insurance commissioners got out and started saying, hey, drones are coming, you're probably going to get them as a gift. You likely have coverage under your homeowner's policies. Not every homeowner insurer agreed with that, but that's a different, a different discussion. What we've seen in response to that, in response to what the public statements have been, and what the understanding has been, is that homeowners insurers are now modifying their wordings to exclude drones specifically and then allow for a right back for the coverage if you want it, because there is room for ambiguity in coverage disputes. Some issues for insurers to consider. This is particularly for those who are looking to write the coverage. We've got very little loss history. As I mentioned earlier, we've got unregulated equipment manufacturers, so you have divergence in quality and reliability of the platforms. We got really low barriers to entry. It used to be you had to be a private pilot. Now, $150 you can go get your remote pilot and command certificate. For another $1,000 or $2,000, you can get yourself a drone, and you're out there and you're a drone pilot, you've got a drone business. And my experience has been when you get low barriers to entry, new technology, you're going to have a lot of claims. So I think it's going to be rough sledding in the early years with respect to trying to write and rate these risks until some of the newcomers fall out and we get some loss history and some experience with it.
Just real quick on that, the one add-on to that, and certainly the low barrier is an aspect. So larger corporations that have their insurance programs in place, you don't always know what the different branch of the company is doing. And we've seen that, have had companies and folks come to us to ask about that, where hey, Joe out here wants to use a drone and has been using it, by the way, for the last 2 months to take little progress photos, to do different things. And is that operation covered? Was it legal to begin with? And so how do we go from there? So as these early days, those are issues that are still going to be propping up here and there.
And the last one we're going to put up are just a few more issues to consider. You've got the interplay of the illegal acts exclusion and operating requirements. The environment's pretty strict under 107. If you're flying at night and have an accident, have you lost coverage? Another one to consider is if you've got an insured with an aircraft policy or an aviation policy, is it going to respond? You shouldn't automatically assume it does. Most general aviation liability policies only provide coverage for declared aircraft, so if those drones weren't declared, you don't have any coverage. And the last one, again, is the cyber coverage. Drone companies, and we've talked to operators, they don't realize it yet, but they are going to be big hacking targets because they're going out, their business is to go capture, process, and work with valuable data for clients. That's a great ransomware target because you've gone out and got all this data and they're saying, well, I don't have any credit card information. It doesn't matter. You've told this massive construction company you're going to do all this work with their data for them. If you can't turn that over to them, you've got a very significant problem. So there's the cyber side of it as well. That's our presentation for today. We want to thank you all for coming and listening to us and for inviting us out to this beautiful setting. It's absolutely fantastic. We're really interested in this topic. We think it is going to be impacting a lot of folks in the months and years to come. It is the next wave. We're happy to answer any questions you have now, or if you see us around the resort, feel free to grab us and ask a question. And when you get back to cold, hard reality and have to leave this beautiful spot, feel free to call us.